directly in the lives and of our citizens and or business. So thanks, Julius.
Thank you very much. Next, we will turn it over to. Thank you very much, Senator Coran. Next, we will turn it over to Blake Masters, who can talk about the efforts underway in his home state of Arizona, and well as perhaps offer some perspective from his vantage point in the tech and venture capital industry. Blake?
Cool. Well, thank you, Julius, and thank you, Chris, for organizing this today. We're here to talk about app stores and run by these big tech companies. And I want to start by suggesting that I don't think big tech is necessarily the right term for these companies. They're certainly big, but I'm not sure there's too much technology, new technology that's actually being developed. These companies have become giant. They've become rent seekers, and they become monopolists who employ armies of lobbyists to come and do everything they can to make sure that the cash keeps flowing in. So I want to talk a little bit about this concrete example that we saw here in Arizona in the last couple of months. Arizona Senate Bill 2005 passed the Arizona House of Representatives in March of this year. And it was pretty interesting. It was, I think, modeled on the North Dakota bill, and it would have allowed app developers to bypass Apple and Google's App Store entirely, and therefore sort of escape the 30% fee or commission or tax or whatever you want to say, Apple's cut that they insist on taking from developers. And you had this really bizarre debate in the Arizona House. You had Republicans, very conservative House Republicans, who were talking about exploitation and consumer protection and looking out for the little guy. And then on the other side of the aisle, you had Democrats. One guy named Cesar Chavez, I remember a poll quote, he was going on and on about the sanctity of private contract. And he was adamant that no, these giant corporations absolutely must be able to keep all of the money that they're able to get their hands on, because free enterprise. So it was this really weird bill. It passed the Arizona House. I think it was unexpected. And that is when the armies of lobbyists sort of descended in. And in Arizona, we have a Republican Senate, but a pretty thin majority. And so the lobbyists were able to pick off enough legislators where the bill was effectively just spiked on the Senate floor. So that didn't pass. That's a shame. That would have been a really good start, to sort of weaken these companies' strangleholds over their app ecosystems. But it got me thinking, and I just sort of posed this question to you. It's like, why do we even have an app store at all? It's kind of a new concept, actually, right? For most of computing, if you remember the pre-iPhone era, in the PC heyday, you didn't have an app store, right? You got floppy disks and you installed software from CD-ROMs and then DVDs. Or when I was in school, you just go to a developer's website and you download the software that you wanted to use. And it's worth remembering, Steve Jobs himself didn't actually want an app store. And for the first year of the iPhone's existence, it didn't exist. iPhone came out in summer of 2007. It wasn't until July of 2008 that you actually saw an app store. And so why even have an app store? Apple's line then in 2008 and now today has been consistent. They say it's about consumer protection, right? Quality control. There's sort of two elements to this. One is scammy apps, right? Apple doesn't want people to be bothered by low quality apps or predatory apps. And two is the more raw security piece, hacking. They don't want badly written apps to introduce security vulnerabilities. And that all makes sense in theory. And then you actually have to check and see, like, well, how is Apple's track record? How are they actually doing on this front? And if you just look at the scammy apps component, I'm sure you've noticed, but there's a ton of shitty apps in the App Store. They are really bad. There's about 2 million apps in the App Store, and tens of thousands of them, at least, are some version of scammy or predatory. These apps are very good at getting people to, put in their credit card, sign up for a recurring charge. Turns out to be pretty hard to cancel. And you can find these apps because they have thousands of one-star reviews, people complaining, people screaming for help. And Apple keeps those apps in the App Store. Some they pick out, but mostly they keep them in. And you got to wonder why, and you got to wonder if it has to do with the 30% cut they're taking. And the second piece, hacking, the whole promise of the iPhone and Apple products generally has been security. And it's true that the security used to be quite good relative to, say, Microsoft Windows. But the open secret in sort of hacking communities is the iPhone has lately become something of a joke. The iPhone is now an easier target to go after than a new Android phone. And one way you can tell, by the way, is to look at the market price of iPhone exploits, right? What is a bad actor willing to pay to receive a sort of known security vulnerability to get them into someone's iPhone? And that market price is basically plummeted almost all the way down to zero because it just doesn't take a lot of technical skill anymore to break your way into an iPhone. The most expensive exploits these days are actually Microsoft Windows. So it's funny to see how the tables turn. That means Apple's basically just failing at this consumer protection stated goal, right? That goal, I think, is just pure PR at this point. And so what's really going on is as Apple has grown into this giant company, it's changed its business model. And Tim Cook actually brags about this. He says openly that Apple has become a services company. And what that really means, I think it's code for Apple is just happy to extract rents from everybody who owns an iOS device, everyone who owns an Apple device, and every developer who wants to develop for that ecosystem. Quick aside, I know I'm beating up on Apple specifically here, but I think you can think of Google in very similar terms. It's true that Android, historically and by default is sort of more open. You can sideload apps onto your Android phone. You can even replace the operating system. But lately, it's gotten harder and harder to do that. And now there's a core suite of Android services that's very hard to pull off an Android device. So I've seen Google sort of marching steadily towards this Apple model, and I expect them to fully converge on it before long, if unchecked. But when I say that Apple is collecting rents from people, I don't just mean that in the sort of economic or technical sense. I mean, they literally treat you like you do not own your iPhone. You just rent it from Apple. So it's like, congratulations, you paid $1,000 for your iPhone. But why can you only download apps from one particular app store? And then even when you download that app, you don't really own it, right? Apple can remotely disable any app, anytime, for basically any reason. And so here's a thought experiment. If Donald Trump were to make an iPhone app, and if each of the 70 million plus people who voted for him downloaded that app, to stay in touch, because you can't hear from him on Twitter and you can't hear from him on Facebook, Apple can just brick that app anytime, remotely disable it, it's gone. And, I wouldn't put it past them. I think we would expect them to do stuff like that because the truth is Apple plays politics and they play it openly. This dystopian precedent, I think, was already set. The Parler episode was just a start. If you look at what goes on in Russia when you buy an iPhone, it comes preloaded with certain apps that the Russian government requires Apple to install. And Apple's just happy to play ball. And of course, Apple's deeply embedded with China. There's no doubt that Apple kowtows to China. And whenever the CCP asks for a user's private encryption keys, Apple gives it to them. They'll say they don't, and we all know that that's not true. And, we saw this recent episode where employees in Cupertino were up in arms. They organized against the hiring of this guy that they disagreed with, and they forced Apple to fire him quickly. They were so upset, they felt unsafe. And these are the people who are very quiet about the slave labor that Apple uses to actually manufacture the designs coming out of Cupertino. So at this point, I don't trust much of what Apple says. I don't think there's one single person more responsible for debasing U.S. industrial capacity than Tim Cook. Shenzhen can only exist because of Apple. And this is it's their playbook. It's their playbook that every huge company follows and that Wall Street has just been following. So I think it's worth really discounting what these companies say. Ultimately, I think it's very sad that this bill failed in Arizona. I think it would have been great for it to have passed, in the Senate, and it would have been great for Governor Ducey to sign it. It may feel like a small thing, right? Just maybe lowering the commission from 30% to something more reasonable. But that would actually meaningfully clip these companies' power. And, Apple says they need an app store to protect consumers. It may actually be the monopolistic app store itself that does the most harm to consumers in this context. But then zooming way out, I think at least in this App Store context, we have a legal framework to think about, how to fight back here, and it's antitrust and consumer protection. What I think we need to think a lot harder about is what are the areas of big tech? What are the problems where existing laws don't lend themselves neatly towards any solutions? So like targeted advertising, for instance, or just how generally do we think about protecting Americans' data? I think this is the fight of the future, and it starts with electing people who actually understand this stuff and who can actually fight back. We have some elected officials here joining us as panelists, and some people who are thinking about getting into the mix. But we need people who understand the terminology, who won't get blown out of the water in a Senate fight. We need to think clearly about these issues and speak clearly about them, because how to regulate these companies, I think, is one of the key fights in the next 3 or 4 years. And it's just clear to me, I'll conclude with this last thought, it's clear to me we have to do it. We have to do it because these companies will not stop. They will not stop. They will do anything they can to entrench their power, to keep the cash flowing in. And then they'll say anything to sort of obfuscate what they're doing. They may be so brave as to, change their logo to the pride flag, or, they'll certainly mutter inanities about human rights and privacy, and they don't really believe it. They don't really believe it. I think they're bad actors. And, it's unfortunate what happened in Arizona, but while it was a false start, it was actually a really interesting start. And so I say, let's learn from it and let's build on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Blake. I found that very informative. I'm sure we'll come back to a lot of those issues. I also want to apologize to anyone on the live stream. I know we had some issues with that. I will blame big tech, of course. But I think most of it was while I was just babbling. So we'll put up a full video later. You can catch up on that. But now we will turn to Representative Fiona McFarland of Florida to discuss the work that she has been doing on these issues.
Thank you, Julius and Chris, for having us on today. And this is such a great panel. I think we're hearing, already such interesting takes on this. And I think Senator Cornyn really underlined it by saying we find ourselves in very interesting position here as Republicans wanting to regulate the private sector. And Blake told us a little bit about some of the nuance of the discussion and how the two parties seem to almost introvert themselves on the floor in the Arizona legislature. Now, we thought very deeply about that in Florida, and we took a different approach. Now, I'll just caveat by saying some background. The Florida legislature is in session for 60 days a year, and we have quite a short amount of time, therefore, to spin up on issues and then pass legislation. The bill that we were able to pass in our session that just finished in April was social media censorship. It was a big priority of our governor, Ron DeSantis. We have a Republican House and a Republican Senate, and that was a bill we were able to get passed. The bill that we were not able to pass, this is a slightly different take on the App Store debate, is around consumer data privacy. We incredible support on both sides of the aisle. But where we found ourselves differing was between the House and the Senate on elements of enforcement. And as many policy writers out there will know, it's great to pontificate about what the world should look like, but when it comes down to operations and enforcement, that's where great policy often falls apart. And we had some differences that we couldn't reconcile between the House and the Senate, and we just decided to wait until next session to pick up the conversation. And here's the approach we took to consumer data privacy. Although Florida is incredibly business friendly, and we never like to get in the position of telling a business how to business, what we feel in the realm of data privacy is that the balance of power has tipped too far away from consumers owning their own information, and that power has shifted incredibly towards not only big tech companies, as Blake has highlighted so well, but also really any company out there. It's how you shop at your gas station, or it's in some cases how you bank online. A lot of your personal data, we sort of, even those of us who are very clued into how data works, we sort of think we know what happens to our private information when we exchange it and hand it over to companies, but it's not really ever clear. And a great deal of that, of course, is trade secrets and confidential company information, and I completely respect that. But where we felt in Florida the balance has tipped too far is that the consumer has really lost control over who has their information and what's done with it. So our bill here in Florida would do a couple things. The first would establish a right of privacy, a right for a consumer to know what information a company has about them, how they got it, what sources they got it from, and then what they do with it. Secondly, the consumer should have the right to request that information in a readable format and then delete it or correct it if they can prove that there's a problem with it. And then lastly, the consumer should be able to opt out of that information being sold or shared with third parties beyond the agreed upon interaction, the contractual interaction with that company. These are really basic elements of privacy that make common sense to everyone when you think about your physical privacy or your physical security. But we've sort of been lulled into complacency when it comes to e-commerce or our online interactions and giving more and more of this stuff away. I went to the Naval Academy for college and was a midshipman when Facebook was first coming out, right? When Facebook would be authorized for each academic institution. When it came to the service academies, our leadership had to think very carefully about, are we really giving a private company information about future service members, their likes, their dislikes, where they're from, where they're currently studying, all of these things. So Facebook actually gave the service academies a special form of Facebook where our hometown was, we weren't allowed to fill out where our hometown was. It was grayed out entirely. We weren't allowed to have inappropriate, Facebook friend our senior officers to keep good order and discipline within the ranks. So things like that. And even just saying these things now sounds so ridiculous. That's not how we expect to interact on social media. And in fact, we think it's great to be able to look up, where someone is from and what you share in common with them. But I share that story just to show an example of how quickly our perception about what's okay and what's not okay for companies to have about us. Now, I mentioned that we had some problems in enforcement, right? So we laid out these basic rights the consumer ought to have, and we really struggled with enforcement. Now, there's been some other states that have attempted this legislation, California, most publicly. Anyone who, if you follow tech state level policy out there, you may know that California, it took them 4 years actually to get a version of this privacy bill passed. It started as a direct ballot referendum. And then finally the legislature was worried that it actually was going to pass. So at the final minute, they drafted policy and passed it as a bill themselves. In California, when they thought about enforcement, they created a private right of action. So an individual could sue a company themselves. California also created a state agency that would be responsible for auditing and inspecting companies. So some elements of that, obviously in a Republican controlled state here in Florida, some of those things we weren't really comfortable in doing. We're not interested in creating, more government, an entire other state agency. But we did take a very provocative step on the House side, at least, and we kept that private right of action. And the reason we did so is this. The alternative is perhaps to put that right to sue in the hands of the Attorney General, which is just fine. We have a fantastic Attorney General here in Florida, and I'm sure that she would love to take on big tech. But I really do feel that no one is a better advocate for their own personal information than themselves. And if we're creating this right for an individual to take control over their own data, again, then we ought to also give them the power to have recourse against companies that violate those rights. So on the House side, we created a private right of action with some restrictions against frivolous lawsuits, of course. And on the Senate side, they put that authority to enforce and bring suits in the case of disregarding the law with the Attorney General. And so we'll see next session where we end up. But that is the trickiest part of the bill. Beyond coming up with the definition of share or the definition of sell, or which financial transactions should be included in this, all of these myriad details that kept us up until the wee hours of the morning. The really, really tricky philosophical issue that ultimately we couldn't resolve in our 60-day session was on enforcement. I don't know the answer. I don't know where we'll land. But that's the fight that we have ahead of us for the next legislative session. And perhaps if we have time for questions later, I'd love to hear from the audience if folks have studied into those areas as well.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sure we will come around to those areas, hopefully on this discussion and certainly in the future. And for our last panelist, we'll go to JD Vance, who also probably has a unique perspective both on the political implications of this as well as from his experience in the private sector VC world and the tech side.
Great, thanks, Julius and Chris and the other panelists. Especially admire Fiona and Mark for doing important work on actually challenging the power of big tech. But I'll just have a couple of high level thoughts, and then we can jump into the Q&A, I suppose, from here. But the first is at a super high level, I was relatively close to Parler as the Parler wars after January 6th really took place. And I think one of the things people don't appreciate about that whole experience is how the entire technology industry seemed to come down on Parler at the same time. And so, it was Google dropping Parler from the Android store, Apple dropping Parler from the App Store, a number of the web services dropping Parler from their services, and of course, AWS actually dropping Parler from its hosting services. All of these things made it incredibly hard for Parler to reach its core consumers and to reach its user base, which can be remarkably destructive, of course, for a company. And it sort of made me realize, thinking through this with Parler, but also thinking through this with other companies that we've either worked with directly as an investor or thought about investing into the venture capital side, is that the entire sort of web architecture is incredibly sensitive to the type of woke capital takeover that we've seen affect Parler and affect some similar companies. And so if you think about what's necessary just from the perspective of a company, not even a conservative company, but just one that's committed to a free and open exchange of ideas, it has to build a remarkably sensitive infrastructure, a robust infrastructure to make it less threatened by a deplatforming incident like what happened to Parler. So it's not just Amazon Web Services or other hosting services. It's not just the App Store, which reaches, depending on the application, between 50 and 90% of its users will be reached through the application, the mobile web application. But it's also CDN services. It's also domain registration services. We talked in sort of, the darkest moments of the Parler experience, I believe, was probably January 10th for me, when I was talking to folks in the company, but also talking to other organizations and other institutions about what they thought was coming from big tech. There was some fear that even the mobile browser itself would not allow you to sort of resolve a name of a website if you tried to go to the wrong website. If you think about trying to go to, say, foxnews.com or breitbart.com and having Safari or Chrome or whatever browser you use not actually resolve, but effectively ban those companies from the internet. I think that we're luckily and mercifully at least a couple of years from big tech taking that sort of step. I think it would really challenge the idea of a free and open internet in the first place. But there are all of these sensitivities sort of built into our core web architecture. And one of the mistakes that we've made as conservatives, I think, is allowing, frankly, our enemies to control so much of that infrastructure, so much of that architecture, and to create all of these choke points where they can basically filter and screen, censor, and ban ultimately our ideas from entering the modern public square. And I think Mark made this point earlier, but of course, this is the modern public square. The idea that you can have a real First Amendment without access to digital technology services, given the amount of power they have in our country, I think is just totally preposterous. And so we have to sort of fight this battle. We have to fight this war if we actually want our ideas to have any chance of making themselves heard. One of the most pernicious forms of censorship, of course, is shadow banning, which is the type of term that I think makes a lot of people's eyes glaze over, but is really, really important. There is this weird conceit that exists in Silicon Valley and frankly exists among certain establishment Republican defenders of Silicon Valley. The idea that so much of what goes on in these tech companies is really smart, right? It's really driven by artificial intelligence. Well, if you know what goes on at these companies, or you know people who work at them, you know, of course, this is totally preposterous and absurd. The idea that Twitter has this super advanced algorithm that decided that Donald Trump wouldn't have access to its services on January 6th, or that that's true for any other much lower profile conservative, is preposterous. We know that the artificial intelligence that's used to filter, to screen, to elevate bad conduct is pretty dumb. The AI doesn't work especially well, and almost always behind a censorship decision, there is not an AI bot that's making the decision. It's actually a human being that's making the decision. That's an important thing to appreciate because so many of these companies, I think, like to hide behind the fact that their artificial intelligence content management service is what's screening a lot of this content, but that's, of course, preposterous. And it's not just banning. Of course, President Trump has been banned from Twitter, from Facebook, from other services as well. But the more pernicious thing is, I've invested in this company, Rumble, along with Blake and some others. We've heard from so many people who do content on YouTube, who provide content to YouTube, who have their main sort of source of income, the content that's hosted on YouTube. And we've had a number of people who've moved from YouTube to Rumble and their viewership numbers skyrocket. Well, why is that happening? Well, one of the reasons it's probably happening is because YouTube's algorithm, or the dumb people behind YouTube's algorithm, actually make it harder for conservative content to be presented to people who want to see that content. And so it's one thing to sort of be totally banned, but it's another thing to have your ability to reach an audience quietly throttled. Say you search JD Vance at the top of a YouTube page, and the first 4 or 5 results aren't the natural results that people actually want to see. Maybe those are the results they see if they go to Rumble. But that's not banning me. I'm still accessible, and the speeches that I've given are still accessible on YouTube. But if you're suppressed and deprioritized by YouTube's content moderators, they can have a similar effect to being banned without the actual physical and very public act of kicking somebody off the platform. That's one of the things that's happening. And frankly, one of the reasons why I think to truly make the digital technology companies answerable to the public and responsible in light of their ability to control the discussion, we probably have to make a number of these platforms open. We have to force them to open up what's actually happening so that we can see these moderation decisions happening in real time, and we can consequently prevent them. So one just other comment, that's sort of the first category of comments. Second category of comments is not so much about the content or the specifics of content moderation, how it's happening in the digital technology space, but about the role of digital technology in our economy more broadly. Because I really think, and I imagine some other folks on this call agree with me, that the digital economy has become remarkably parasitic on the real economy. So I'm in Ohio. Most of the people who work in middle-class jobs in Ohio are working in some sort of manufacturing, healthcare, so forth. Those types of jobs in the real economy are fundamentally penalized and deprioritized by public policy and by our regulatory state in all kinds of subtle ways that I think people don't fully appreciate. So let's just take 2 very important examples in my mind. The first is taxation. The second is regulatory policy. On the tax side, we secretly massively give tax advantages. People don't appreciate this to companies that work in the digital technology space because their assets are primarily intangible intellectual property. So if your assets exist in the cloud, then what you can do is say that your assets exist in Bermuda or Ireland, and so the income generated by those assets is taxed by Bermuda or taxed by Ireland. You get to avoid the corporate taxation system in this country. You get to sort of pretend that you're a Bermuda or Irish company for purposes of taxation. But if you're a steel manufacturer or a trucking company in Ohio or Arizona or anywhere else, you can't just pretend that your assets are located somewhere else, because your assets are very obvious. They're tangible, they're big, they're difficult, if not impossible to move, and they're certainly impossible to pretend that they exist elsewhere. And so one of the things our entire taxation system does is penalize those companies that are working in the real economy. Well, what does that do? it creates a massive incentive if you're a worker or if you're an investor of capital to invest in the low tax companies as opposed to the higher tax companies. So I think probably unintentionally, we've created an entire system where the types of jobs that support middle-class Ohioans are much harder to come by, and the companies who operate in those spaces are much harder to come by compared to the digital technology monopolies that censor conservatives and dominate in Silicon Valley. Now, this is true of our regulatory policy as well, because if you think of so much of our regulatory policy, it's really about making energy more expensive. Well, if you're Facebook, if you're Amazon, if you're Apple, you don't care so much about really expensive energy. You're not as a sort of a function of your economic output. You don't require as much energy as somebody who's manufacturing goods or somebody who's shipping goods from A to B or somebody who's building homes. Those companies really depend on low-cost, high-quality energy. So when our regulatory state effectively penalizes energy creators, what it's doing is rewarding digital tech companies at the expense of the people who are working in the real economy, working with their hands, making real goods, not just doing digital services. Well, of course, that again creates a massive subsidy, a hidden subsidy, and an incentives for capital and workers to move to those digital economy companies. So I really think that this is an important topic because it implicates free speech and the First Amendment and the type of public square we have in this country. But I also think it implicates the type of economy we have, whether we're going to be an economy that makes things or just gives Silicon Valley overlords complete control of our First Amendment and consequently our entire constitutional republic. I obviously think we should stop doing that. That's easier said than done, but at least we're starting to get on the right track, as I think this conversation evidences. So with that, I'll shut up and look forward to the conversation. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much, everyone. We should have a lot of food for thought for Q&A. In case anyone didn't hear it the first time, the easiest way to submit a question to the panelists is just to email it to events@americanaffairsjournal.org. We've got a few already, and I'm going to ask some of my own, so we'll get started with those. The first question is actually, are states strong enough to take on these companies and deal with these problems? And I'm going to insert paraphrasing a little on my own here. I know we did see in places like North Dakota, some of the legislators there did express concern that it was just too difficult for them perhaps to take on some of these giants, and that affected some of their decision making. So maybe starting with Mark and Fiona, once again, the question is, are states strong enough to regulate these tech companies, these tech giants, and they what's the right role and mix of state versus federal policy here?
That brings up a great question. One, I think we need the legal structure, our statutory structure to reflect what needs to be done. But you also highlight one of the other greatest challenges when you talk about collusion. They're not allowed to government or collude with government if government's not a willing partner as well. And that is one of the greatest challenges that I believe we face, is when the government itself has its own political agenda and it supersedes. When I talk about government, I mean the delivery vehicle. Those are the delivery vehicles that would do the enforcement. Do we have an attorney general who reflects and understands what our Constitution is? I think Representative Fiona, I think she spoke about they got a great attorney general. I don't think I'd say that in the state of Minnesota. We have Keith Ellison is our state attorney general. And so it does bring up one of the greatest challenges, not only having the legal structure, but do we have the delivery mechanism to be able to do any form of government that reflects a nonpartisan, should be a nonpartisan nature in the delivery in the administration of law. In Minnesota, we've seen the exact opposite. So that does bring up a huge challenge. Do we have that structure? I would argue in Minnesota we don't. And but it's one of those things I'm blessed with. I know government very, very well. And it's one of the things that we need the greatest level of reform is who we hire in government, not just those that are elected, but who they hire become permanent facilities or institutions within government. And it has its own political agenda. So.
It's no secret that big tech firms and really any company that uses data in a significant way knows how to lobby and has a government relations team and knows exactly what they're doing. This was my first term. I'm a freshman representative here in Florida, my first time being elected, and there was an incredible amount of pressure and input from industry. Now, on one hand, I think that's correct, right? If we're going to regulate a company, we should hear from them what impact that should have. And I said we should hear from them. We shouldn't let them write the legislation, as actually has happened in some states. They should have a seat at the table, though, certainly. This session was sort of unique. So I carried the bill. I was the bill sponsor. And so, heard abundantly from every industry that I didn't even know my bill would impact. But our Capitol, because of COVID, was also closed this session. So in comparison to past years where there would be a line of lobbyists outside of my office every time I left the House floor, that was not the case this year. So I think we sort of had a little bit of it was a unique session for us to make such advancements on tech policy, frankly. And it also definitely helps that we have an aligned House, Senate, and Governor's Mansion. And this was a big priority of Governor Ron DeSantis. So, from within the House and within the team, I had a tremendous amount of support in carrying this bill. And then from outside of the castle, so to speak, there was a tremendous amount of industry pressure. But I wonder if it wasn't perhaps muted or at least held at arm's bay by this weird situation that COVID has put us all in. Now, we'll see. The Capitol will be open for our next session, which starts in January. So it may be very different then, and I may find myself with a very well-funded opponent next legislative cycle. But I do feel optimistic that we'll be able to pass this bill. Now, I think, Julius, you also wondered, you asked a little bit, is our states themselves strong enough to regulate companies or impact these large companies in this way? And I would say that, of course, it would be better if this was passed at a federal level, right? Again, I worked as a business management consultant for a time when I left the Navy, and, putting my management consultant hat on, of course, I would want one set of laws for a national company to have to deal with, as opposed to 50 different state regulations. But I don't have confidence that the federal government is going to pass comprehensive tech policy in any meaningful way. And so I do believe that it has to start from the states. I mentioned California earlier. I have sort of this dream for the future that if California, one of the three largest states in the country, is very left-leaning, and Florida, again, one of the three largest states in the country, very right-leaning, if we are both able to pass data privacy laws in a meaningful way that are sort of similar, have a lot of similar aspects to them, then I think that gives a lot of, I was about to say top cover, but perhaps it's bottom-up groundswell support for our federal representatives to bring such legislation to the table.
I didn't mean to exclude Blake or JD from the previous question, but since we got another one somewhat related to it, I'll throw that in there. And if they want to address one or both, up to them. But the question from the viewer is, how would you describe the scope and intensity of pushback from libertarian-leaning conservatives who argue that since these are private companies, they should in principle be left alone, come what may? And maybe we'll just go with JD and go in reverse order.
Well, as you know, I feel strongly about this question, Julius. So I'll try not to go on for too long. But first of all, I think the complaint, the criticism that these companies are fundamentally private companies is sort of a joke, right? So we've seen Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut. We've seen any number of congressional Democrats actively hauling big tech companies before their committees and arguing that big tech should censor in some form or another. And if they're doing that in public, imagine what they're actually saying in private when the cameras aren't on. The idea that these companies are sort of immune from massive government pressure is just totally preposterous. And even if we assume that they are truly private companies, whatever that means in a world where they're obeying the sort of orders of congressional Democrats, the question that I am most concerned about is the quality of the public square in our republic, not protecting the interests of massive multinational companies who, it turns out, actually hate their citizens and hate the people who live in this country. Apple is actively undermining American values. They're actively funding protest movements that destroyed American cities, and they're actively shipping American manufacturing jobs overseas so that they can have Chinese slaves who can't complain do their dirty work for them. The idea that I should care more about that company than about the people who live here and their quality of speech under the First Amendment is preposterous. I don't care more about them. I care more about our own people and whether they can speak their mind. And they cannot do that in a world where big tech is constantly censoring them. The other thing I'll make here, just to sort of rub a little bit of salt in some of these wounds, is if you look at the institutions, and I believe Terry Schilling and John Schwepp, their group, the American Principles Project, I want to say they were in the news today or yesterday about this very topic. But if you look at the R Street Institute, if you look at some of the biggest think tanks in DC that are actively shilling and effectively lobbying for big tech, they're doing it without disclosing the obvious, which is that much of their salaries are paid by the big tech sector. If your entire there's a way of thinking about big tech and its lobbying efforts in DC as effectively laundering their own interests under the guise of conservative principles. And I think we should call out the fact that many of the people who have their paychecks signed by big tech CEOs and big tech shareholders are pretending that they're all about principle, when in fact, whether they realize it or not, if they didn't say the things that they were saying, they probably would all get fired.
Blake?
I sympathize with the libertarian. Sorry, I'm jumping the order.
Yeah, go for it.
Oh, please.
I sympathize with the libertarian who says, let business. It's not government's role to do so, because I feel that way largely myself. However, when it comes to whether we're talking about data privacy or apps or social media, I don't think that you can really exist meaningfully without using these services. Show me the person who is successfully, paying cash everywhere they go and not ever having their license plate read as they cross state lines, or, show me the person who is not having their data collected and existing productively in society, and perhaps I'll change my tune, but I just don't think that's the case. Mark started us off at the outset by talking about the public square, but it's really that these technology services, as delightful as they are, it's really, it's almost a utility, right? You cannot exist in society. They are ubiquitous. They are present everywhere. And to me, this is the point when it becomes less about government regulating business and more about government allowing the individual to know what is happening to their information and having a voice in this process.
I agree with that, Fiona and JD, everything you said too. Julius, I'd say I don't actually hear too much pushback from libertarians on this. I'm in these legislative district meetings with people here in Arizona. Many of them are sort of Tea Party type libertarians and certainly sympathetic in the ways Fiona is, but I don't hear too much pushback from this free market Republican crowd about big tech, because I think they know. They just, like JD said, these companies hate these core American values, right? And if you want a free market, if you want some dynamic economy where people can actually innovate and do new things, you don't want everything to be controlled by a handful of companies, right? Arizona is the state of Barry Goldwater, and very libertarian-leaning conservative, and his whole thing was to be skeptical of all concentrations of power, whether they're public and governmental or whether they're private, or in this case, more nominally private. So I think people basically get it. I think people know we should have a nation of 6 million or 60 million capitalists, but not like 6. So I don't think there's too much organized libertarian opposition to this, which is good. I think people are with the program and they know these companies are their enemies.
Yeah, just to echo that, I strongly agree with that, Blake. And the sense that I get is that to the extent that there is an organized opposition to a lot of these arguments, it is primarily institutionalized in Washington, D.C. amongst a group of sort of think tanks and academics.
Right.
Obviously a lot of libertarians and people who really care about free market capitalism in the state of Ohio too. Doesn't have quite the tradition of Barry Goldwaterism, but still an important Republican and conservative principle. And the sense that I get is that often libertarians are as concerned about this as anyone, in part because they recognize, to your point, that concentrated power is really bad, even if it exists in the private sector, especially when that concentrated power has developed in part because of special government privileges. And that's the sort of thing that hasn't been mentioned yet, is that these companies many of them are monopolists. I think Apple was effectively a monopolist. I think Facebook and Google are important, close to monopolists. They didn't get there through like the operation of the free market. We can argue about whether they would have gotten there, but in practice, these companies, from the tax system to the regulatory system to Section 230, have benefited from remarkable carve-outs that I think that it's important to keep in mind when we discuss what to do about them, that many of them, their businesses wouldn't be here were it not for the protections of the government.
All right. We have a lot of interesting questions from the audience, and it is very sad that we won't get to them all. But maybe if I'm going to take a risk here and throw out one very quickly, and the questioner has, any thoughts on how we can level the playing field with regards to the big tech companies on taxes and moving assets to low tax countries. I can't remember if it was JD or Blake who mentioned that one, but we've got about a minute left. And if you want to take a shot at that, be my guest.
Hey, Julius, this is Mark Curran. And I think as JD spoke earlier, is that we have to explore all of those activities. When you look at the collusion with the big tech, and not only that, the other portions of corporate America reaching into the political spectrum and from professional sports. Well, I've had legislators, call our local sports teams and ask them, do we need to run by our pending legislation, based on their opinion? They've stuck their nose in many different areas that they never had played before. And I think we need to look at all of the aspects to make sure that we're treated equally. One of the other things that I have a challenge with is, those same entities are hosting all of government services almost exclusively now, all in the cloud. All of those things come into concern, and we're going to have to look at the entire spectrum. How are they treated in the regulatory world? How do they play in the public square? And that's really what we're going to do in Minnesota over the next 4 or 5 months when we come back, is to hold those hearings and take a thorough look of every aspect of what this means. It's well beyond what the original premise was. This is an antitrust for an app store bill. This is the public square. What does it mean when these are monopolies? And I think JD said it as well. They all become the monopoly when they collude, and then how are we going to respond to it? Our mere existence depends on it. So thank you.
I think on that ambitious note, we will draw this discussion to a close. We could cover a lot more ground. I wish we had more time. Certainly these discussions will continue in the future, and we hope to be a venue for them. But thanks again to our panelists. Thanks to all our viewers, especially those who endured our technical difficulties. We hope to continue this discussion soon. Thank you.